I'm delighted to welcome my guest for today's podcast, Professor Rosie Green. And Rosie is Professor of Environment, Food and Health and Co-Director of the Centre on Climate Change and Planetary Health at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And Rosie's research explores the impact of diets on the environment and health. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast, Rosie.
Thank you for having me.
One of the reasons I was really keen to talk to you is that when I give talks, one of the questions that comes up again and again is plant milk better than dairy? And if so, which plant milk is best? And I know that's one of the many things you've worked on. So I was really keen for listeners to hear your perspective on this question. But before we dive in, do you want to tell us a bit about what plant-based alternative foods are and why researchers like you are interested in studying them?
Yeah, sure. I think it's really topical at the moment, isn't it? Because you can just see if you go into a supermarket that these foods have really proliferated in recent years. I think people who were vegan or vegetarian 10 or more years ago could tell you that it's such a different prospect now. There are so many more foods to choose than there were a few years ago because the sort of food technology has moved on and there's much more market for these sorts of things these days. So we would consider we call them plant-based alternative foods, or, different permutations of similar wording, but we would consider those to be anything that would really substitute for an animal food in your diet. So it might substitute for meat, it might substitute for dairy, or less common, but it might even substitute for eggs or something like that. And these foods are designed to sort of replace meat and dairy in people's diets without a sort of complete overhaul of the diet. So they're designed to make those kinds of switches that might be desirable from an environmental perspective, even from a health perspective, from an animal welfare perspective, designed to make it just that little bit easier. And so we're doing a lot of research on what the actual impacts are of those switches and which ones might be more beneficial for people's health and the environment and which ones might be a bit less.
Amazing. Okay, well, let's get into some details then. So if we think about dairy, when we're talking about alternatives to dairy, then, for example, we might be talking about plant milks like oat milk, almond milk, soy milk. There's quite a long list, isn't there? So can you tell listeners about how plant and dairy milks compare in terms of their climate impacts? And I guess which plant milk is best?
Yes, there's been definitely a lot of debate about this in recent years. And I think it can sometimes feel a bit overwhelming to people because they're thinking, should I be drinking almond milk or should I be drinking soy milk? And they're hearing in the press that there are lots of problems with all of these different types of plant milk. And I think that's true to a certain extent. So many people would know that, for example, growing almonds in California uses a lot of water. And so almond milk is not necessarily good for the planet from that point of view. And that soybeans can be grown on deforested land. And so maybe soy milk is not so great from that point of view. But my view on it is that when you take an overview, even considering all of those things, most plant milks are still less damaging to the environment than dairy milk. And we've seen a real rise in oat milk in recent years. In fact, I think oat milk has now become more popular than almond milk as an alternative. And that seems to be a pretty good all-round choice. It has lower greenhouse gas emissions. It uses less land. It uses less water. Oats can often be grown quite well in the UK. So I think that's becoming a really popular choice for people as an alternative to dairy. And of course, now you can get your foaming version to use in your tea and coffee as well. So there's a lot more choice again than there used to be.
So how different are the climate impacts? If you take oat milk and dairy milk, for example, is it really a big difference?
Yeah, it's less than half the greenhouse gas emissions and often a lot less than half. So it is quite a big difference. Obviously, it is a bit dependent on how your dairy milk is produced. There are ways of producing dairy milk that use less resources and produce less emissions than the standard. But it is still quite a big difference in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and in terms of water as well.
I know we worked a lot on the water impact of various different foods in the past, and you've done a lot of details on that. So what, is that bad? How bad is it?
So I think almond milk, it uses a lot more water than other plant-based alternatives. But again, it's quite a complicated story because it depends where you're getting your almonds from. If they're being grown in California and they're being artificially irrigated, then that is kind of quite an extreme use of natural resources. if they're being grown in Europe and there's a bit more rainfall, then it's maybe not quite such a difference. But of the plant-based milks, almond definitely uses the most water, but it's still on average less than dairy milk. So it's not a simple point to make, but I would say that generally, environmentally speaking, you can pretty safely say that the plant milks are less damaging.
Okay, that's really helpful for people to hear. So on the other hand, I suppose the counter to that is the nutrition then. So people, obviously rightly pointing out, as I understand, that the dairy milk's there's a lot of nutrition you're getting from dairy that you might miss out on with the plant milk. So what do you say to people about that?
Yeah, this is a really interesting one. And actually, when we started researching these foods a few years ago, we were really surprised to find that nobody had really looked into this at all. That people were saying, oh, yes, these alternatives to dairy are a great choice environmentally. But no one had actually really sat down and tried to work out if they might be better or worse for people's health. And so in our research team, we've actually just finished a big review of all of the studies on this topic to try and work out what the answer is to that question. And the answer, of course, is that it's kind of complicated. There are plant milks out there that are actually really good, nutritionally speaking, that they're fortified with vitamins, so they contain the calcium that dairy milk would do. And so you're not losing out necessarily nutritionally, but also they might contain some legumes, which are a positive nutritional part of our diet that dairy milk wouldn't give you. Yeah. So there's some of these plant milks could be considered healthy, but some of them are not. Some of them are not fortified. Some of them are essentially water with quite a lot of sugar in it. And there's not really an easy way of telling which are which, and without delving in great detail into the labels and without really knowing a lot about it. So I think one of the really important things we need to do is to campaign for a bit more regulation of these plant-based alternative foods so that people can really understand what it is they're buying and what nutritionally they're getting from it, because I've got a degree in this stuff and I find it really difficult to figure out what's in all of them and what's good and what's less good.
I love playing around with looking at all the nutrition and seeing, what am I getting from other things and what am I missing? I mean, things like vitamin D and iodine seem to be things that pop out of that sort of work. If people are looking at labels on plant-based milks and trying to check have they got the right fortification, which things would you suggest people look out for?
I think, the ones you just mentioned are a really good example where some plant-based milks have a lot and some have none at all. Calcium as well is a good one to look for, because that's a thing that a lot of people are deficient in the UK and don't necessarily realise it. And that's something that you obviously would get from dairy milk, but that you wouldn't necessarily get from a plant-based alternative. So I think that's one that's worth keeping an eye on as well.
Brilliant. Okay, great. Okay, well, shall we move on to meat alternatives now? So I guess maybe let's just start with, do you want to give some examples and how much difference does it make to climate change?
Yes, there's this sort of a burgeoning market, isn't there, of all sorts of different meat alternatives. And again, some of them are probably a good option for your health and some of them less so. So you might have your what's called mycoprotein alternatives, which is a sort of fungus-based alternative. It's been around for quite a long time. Quorn is the obvious example, although other brands are available. There's pea protein, which is becoming very popular nowadays. Then there's the more traditional alternatives that would be soya-based. So the content of these meat alternatives is so different. And then more recently, you've got the sort of Beyond Meat, Impossible Burger type alternatives that are designed to really, really mimic the appearance and the texture and the feel of meat in the way that previous generations didn't do. And again, it's can be quite difficult to figure out what's healthy or less healthy about these foods. I think a lot of people are very concerned about the level of processing in their food nowadays, and not without good reason. I think there is a move back to much more whole foods, and that's a positive thing. But I think a bit of the nuance can be lost sometimes, because some of these foods probably can be a reasonably healthy substitute. It's just that, again, it's hard to figure out which ones and what they might be good for. So
I suppose if we take an example like a burger, then, if we talk about, I realise there's lots of different types of plant-based burger, but in general, do you want to maybe get across the sort of size of difference on climate impact between like a plant-based burger and a beef burger or something like that?
Yeah, it would be a huge difference, really. I mean, beef is one of the foods that tends to have the highest environmental impact, and with the same as with the milk, really, it can vary depending on how the meat is produced, but it's still going to have of the order of 10 times the environmental impact of a meat substitute that goes into the production of that beef burger, unfortunately. And it's a hard thing to really bridge that gap, I think, between animal source foods and plant ones, because there's just so much more that goes into the raising of the animal and the feeding of the animal and the waste of the animal. It's just creates a lot more environmental impact than growing the plants and then eating the plants.
Okay, that's really helpful to note. And I guess when we're talking about the health benefits of these things, and you mentioned about ultra processed foods there, and I know that's quite a hot topic at the moment. Are there particular ingredients that you would look for on a packet, or that to avoid or to include if you were choosing a burger that was plant based?
I think it's always nice to see that it's based on something that would give you part of your 5 a day. That's kind of a rule that I would follow a little bit. So if it's got beans in it that substitute for the meat protein, that's probably going to be a bit more healthy for you, because beans are a good source of protein and lots of other things that we need in our diet. If it's a load of ingredients that you don't necessarily recognize the names of, it's probably going to be a bit less of a healthy substitute. So yeah, there might be burgers that are bean-based, or some of them would be mycoprotein-based, and that's been shown to have some quite positive health impacts as well. So adding anything mushroom-related to your diet tends to be quite good for your health. But there are other substitutes where you might not really recognise a lot of the ingredients. A lot of it might be sort of bulked out with cereals and with a lot of added salt, added sugar, and that's not going to be such a healthy option to choose.
Just since you mentioned cereals there, I'm just going to come in with a slightly sort of techie question that we may edit out. But I'm just curious about, there's a few which have got quite a lot of gluten or, wheat protein, I guess they would write on the label. What do you think about those meat substitutes? There's quite a few of them now, I'm noticing.
Yeah, I've seen a few of those popping up as well. And I think it's not necessarily going to contribute positive nutrients to your diet. It's a way to sort of fill, like I said, it's kind of a way to fill you up and to make it more of a kind of meal like proposition. But I don't think if it's not contributing positive stuff to your diet, then it's probably not a great choice health wise. I can see why people are doing it that way, because it's a relatively cheap way of making meat alternatives, but it's probably not going to do you much good.
Okay, so I guess we've talked so far about these direct substitutions, things that look the same, like a burger shape and another burger shape. But, what about just changing the shape of the meal completely? And, for example, having a curry and rice or something which is very different, which could be maybe more naturally easy to make plant-based. What do you think about the pros and cons of that kind of approach?
We probably need a little bit of both, to be honest. I think there's room for all sorts of changes. I think the appeal of the meat and dairy alternatives is for people that particularly are struggling to change their diet and they're not sure how to substitute things, and they're maybe really busy and they need something quick that's more ready-made. I think those alternatives can really help people in that zone. But if you want to get a bigger shift where people are, maybe cooking a bit more from scratch again, and they're moving back towards more whole foods, which is definitely positive for health, then there's definitely a case to be made for rejigging the way people are eating a little bit. And I think also meat reduction is great. That's something that I do a lot in my cooking, that maybe I'll replace half of the mince in a spaghetti bolognese with lentils. And then it's, my kids are eating more lentils. They don't actually really notice because there's still some meat in it, but it's just that there's a bit less. And that can make a huge difference actually to the amount of meat you're eating as a family or as an individual.
I was wondering about taste and kids accepting these things and your thoughts on how do you get people to actually eat some of these things. So that's a really good tip there. What are the sort of barriers, would you say, to people actually buying these meat alternatives and dairy alternatives, would you say?
I think cost is a huge one. We've done some research on this as well, and those alternatives are more expensive for what you get, and there's not really a reason for them to be more expensive. I think that prices have maybe come down a little bit, but it doesn't really make a lot of sense that a plant-based milk should be, 1.5 times the cost of dairy milk, and the same for the meat alternatives. So I think that's a big one. And I think the concern about processing is another one. I think a lot of people think, oh, these things are not real food. They're not going to be healthy for me. And in some cases, they're probably right. But I think it's about choosing the options a little bit carefully and having the information to know what's more likely to be good for you.
So I guess, how is that going in terms of, we've seen this huge rise in these alternatives over the last few years. Do you think that's going to keep going up?
It's a bit of a mixed picture, I would say. So there was, I don't know if you saw, but there's been quite a lot of news in the last 6 months about meat alternatives in particular really dropping in value. So some of the big alternative burger and meat companies have seen their shares drop because people are actually moving away from them a bit again. And I think, again, that those are for the reasons that we've just been talking about. Probably it's the price, it's the fact that we're in a cost of living crisis and people need to have the cheapest option. And it's about the concern about what is actually in these foods and is it good for me? But the plant-based milks seem to continue going from strength to strength. So I think there are alternatives that people are really switching to. I think it's about 40% of people, of adults in the UK now, are regularly drinking plant-based milks. And that's actually a huge change from what it would have been 10 years ago. So I think those ones where it's now become normalized, where it's perfectly fine now to ask for your coffee in your coffee shop with oat milk. I don't see that particularly dropping off again now. I think people have accepted it as a normal part of their diet, and it will probably carry on that way. Whereas plant-based cheese, which is a particular bugbear of mine, because I found
there are
really
some good ones, but most of them are vile, aren't they? Surely, yeah.
Oh, to find, aren't they? Yeah. I mean, I've really tried with plant-based cheese, but it's a challenge to find something that tastes not like rubber.
Rubber actually would be actually preferable, I think, to some of them, don't you think?
It might be. And also not really very healthy for you. Again, we've done some research on this, and most of the plant-based cheese is full of coconut oil, and it's not giving you any positive nutrients. It's just giving you a load of fat and salt just to try and replicate that, the effect of cheese. So I don't see the plant-based cheese market particularly growing unless there's a revolution in how it tastes, which there might be. But plant-based milk, I think, is here to stay. And I think it's because it's convenient for people. It fits into their lives. It does taste reasonably like dairy milk. People feel like they understand what it is. It's better for the environment, and people just have a bit more confidence in it, I think, than they do some of these other substitutes.
So I'm really interested in that sort of social transition that you're kind of describing there of that being socially acceptable to ask for plant milk at a coffee shop, for example. And I was at a talk by Justin Benton of the Green Alliance, who was sort of talking about the energy transition and 15 years ago, all the coal and would we transition to solar, and was it going to happen? And it seemed very sort of expensive and maybe unpopular, and that the massive change that's happened there. And he was trying to sort of draw a parallel between that and food. I'm curious what you think about that. I think he was pretty much phrasing these alternatives as a sort of the solar power of the food transition, in terms of, could the price come down enough and the sort of social side be sufficiently, positive about them? But what do you think? Is there really an analogy between energy and food?
I think there could be. I really think it's possible, and for so many reasons as well. I often do this kind of thought experiment that's to do with, when my grandchildren, should I be lucky enough to have any, when they're adults, what will they think back on with my generation and think, oh, they used to do that, and that's crazy that they used to do that. And one of the things I think about is, we used to have big sheds with millions of chickens in and millions of animals in, and we used to keep them like that. And then we used to sort of industrially slaughter them and eat them. And I do wonder if that's one of those things where my grandchildren will be like, what? Why were you doing that when you had all of these other choices? So I think it's feasible. I think, I don't think that meat and dairy will disappear from the planet altogether, and nor do I think that they should necessarily. I think it's important for many reasons to still have those foods and that kind of farming and have livestock and everything. I think that's probably really necessary, but to the level at which we're doing
quantities,
where we're not really thinking about the fact that our sandwich has a load of not very nice chicken in it, or the fact that we eat a lot of fast food that's just meat and chips, basically. I do wonder whether generationally there'll be a tipping point where people will go, oh, actually, maybe that's not so okay. Maybe smoking is a different analogy. I mean, it's not quite the same with the planet, but maybe it will become a bit more socially unacceptable to be sort of chewing on a huge mass-produced burger. I don't know.
Brilliant. I like that looking back sort of perspective. At the end of every episode, I'm asking my guests, what are you going to have for dinner today?
Well, I am a post-COVID long-distance commuter. So I am getting a train from London to my house in Devon this afternoon. And I'm also in a zone where I have two extremely fussy, quite young children. So what I will probably be doing is getting on my train, making my kids a meal because they won't eat what I eat, trying to shoehorn some vegetables into that meal, where they would prefer it to be exclusively freezer tapas. And then making me and my husband something else, which is thrown together from what's in the fridge. Probably some kind of vegetable chili, I would imagine, but there's no way my kids would eat that. So
that's really helpful to hear that lived experience of somebody with all your expertise and the realities of having to get that train and cook for kids that are a bit fussy. So very much best of luck with your train journey, first of all, and I hope you have a lovely dinner. And thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And thanks again, Rosie. That's been brilliant. Thank you.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.